Welcome, and thanks for listening to Intrinsic Investigations. My name is Mr. Olivo, and I created this podcast because I've been fortunate enough over the last decade to see unique and thought-provoking projects happen in my classroom, and we wanted a place to showcase them. The true heart of this podcast lies not in the content discovered, but in exploring the personal stories of these young researchers as they journey through uncharted and unfamiliar intellectual terrain. By sharing their stories, we hope to normalize the challenges and frustrations that come with independent research, and also share those moments where students transcend the normal grind of the school day to discover concepts that range from the global to deeply personal. We will begin with a brief introduction to the student of focus, why they picked their topic, and discuss their growth over the course of the last year. It should be mentioned that the opinions expressed in this podcast in no way reflect the opinions of our school district, Bergen County Technical Schools and Special Services, or our school itself, Bergen County Technical High School, Teterboro, or the College Board. The work detailed in this podcast was most likely completed in AP Capstone, but this podcast is in no way affiliated with the College Board. In our first and only dual interview all year, we have Katie and Kaylee, who are going to introduce themselves in a moment, but their topics converge around the idea of gender dynamics in two very different contexts. But Katie, you want to go first? Just introduce yourself.
My name is Katie Trinidad. I'm a junior at Bergen Tech, and I'm in the Law and Justice program, and my project was focused on objectification within R&B and hip-hop.
All right, and Kaylee?
I'm Kaylee Pena. I'm an 11th grader in the Law and Justice major, and my research was focused on over-sexualization and the parallelism between women's and girls' Halloween costumes.
You're both in the Law and Justice major. You're both 11th graders. Are you doing this podcast just because you're buds, or because you feel like there are strong connections between your work? Both are fine, or it could be both. You can go ahead.
I feel like throughout the project, me and Katie talked a lot about our projects because they are so similar. A few of my studies she also included in her research as well. So just like the overall dynamic of the objectification and how it pertains to over-sexualization. So I think there are very much some crossovers between our topics.
Okay. Katie, any thoughts on that, or did Kaylee sum it up?
She basically summed it up. It wasn't intentional, but it was kind of like by chance, not by choice.
All right. and we laugh about it. Kaylee, you want to explain why you chose the topic you chose, and then Katie will get to you.
Yeah, so actually this topic, I started researching it in SEM at the end of the year when we do like the mini research portfolio. And I knew I wanted to do something related to gender or race. I did that a lot in SEM as well. I talked a lot about race and like gender dynamics as well, and like systematic inequality. So I knew I wanted to do something pertaining to that. So when actually my first idea was how Disney princesses are over-sexualized, because I found a lot of research on that. And again, I was doing this at the end of AP Sem, so I was still, like dipping my toes in the water. Yeah. But then I don't even know how I like found the topic. I think I was actually scrolling on Instagram one day, and like the Mean Girls clip came up where it's like she's talking about how like in girl world Halloween is the one day a year where a girl can dress like a total and no one can say anything about it essentially. Yep. That quote, if you're familiar with it. But then that started to get me thinking, like, how is it that this has become the norm where over sexualization, if that's not apparent in your costume, you're seen as like ostracized. So.
This is, I feel like, at least the 10th example of somebody saying they saw something on either TikTok or Instagram, and then it just sparked this curiosity of I wonder why that's even a thing.
Right, because I was already looking into like over-sexualization, again, but I was looking more so in like Disney princesses, but then when it came up, I was like, oh, like I connected it back, and I was like, this is a good topic.
Yeah, and everybody sees it. I mean, Halloween costumes are out of control right now. All right, Katie. So your topic, what do you what sparked it for you?
I wasn't as lucky in the sense that I didn't really get to build off of what I did in time, just because I kind of didn't want to. But
that's okay. Yeah, knowing what you don't want to do is valuable as well.
Yeah, but it was sort of like a fusion of like multiple like interests I had, I guess. So like I knew I wanted to do something regarding like gender studies, because that was just something that was like, every time I came up with an idea, that was like something I found in common. And then also just like music, like I feel like that's a big part of my life. Like my grandpa's a DJ, and like
what does he spin? What does he spin?
Spanish, like music in Spanish.
Okay. Right.
And like also like I listen to music every day. I know the people around me listen to music every day, adolescents. So I kind of drew from those two things, and I came up with this topic.
All right, I'm gonna stay with you, Katie, and then we're gonna move the question to Kaylee. So you have this personal interest in music. What sources did you come across early on that helped you kind of figure out, like, yeah, you know what, I want to focus this on objectification in lyrics. Within, I think it's between genders, or it's like cross gender, like males
versus,
yeah. So comparing those things, and then I think one of the strengths of yours was you defined objectification really well. Mm-hmm. So you want to talk about that, like how you use sources to define objectification and how then you applied that to music?
Yeah, so one of the first sources that I felt was like really formative was one written by Elizabeth Otto, and she sort of focused on how Black women in hip hop and R&B were being, I think, sexualized and objectified, or sexually objectified by men. Mm-hmm. And that sort of like is kind of like what I built off of, because I sort of saw that connection between like music and objectification, which was like gender studies. So I kind of focus on that, and then from there I dig deeper into like those topics sort of separately. So I looked at objectification, and there I was able to find like this framework that ended up helping me actually with my method, and I was able to use it to actually like perform my study, which was sort of like a compilation of a bunch of sort of forms of objectification. So that included things like fungibility, violability, reduction to appearance, reduction to body, and it was 10 total, and the first 7 were written by Martin Nussbaum in, I believe, 1996, and then Ray Langton added to that later on in the 2000s, and so I sort of found those like together under the source written by Papadaki, and from there I realized like there are many different forms of objectification, and that was sort of something I wanted to represent through my like own work.
And that's interesting because this is probably the third time a student has observed objectification in the course, but usually they focused on one of the things, and you had like 10. I think the most commonly used one was reduction to a body part. It was like reducing someone to just like that, like some part of their body, like that's all that they are. So it was interesting that you had those 10 different ways of being objectified, and we'll get into that and how it appears in the music that you observed. Kaylee, you're looking at Halloween costumes. How does one take an academic approach at doing that? Because, someone could be listening right now like, well, okay, Halloween costumes, like, what are you going to do with that?
Right. So I think that the main thing that I wanted to first put out there was the definition of over-sexualization and how it's apparent all throughout the media, including in the fashion industry. So similar to Katie, how she had like the different prongs of objectification, like the American Psychological Association defines over-sexualization, that it can meet 5 different criteria in order to be considered over-sexualized. So there's like similar to objectification, like when a person's value is reduced only to sexual appeal, when the attractiveness equates to this idea of like being sexy, when a person is just straight up sexually objectified, when sexuality is imposed on someone, and when particularly children are given adult sexual traits. So that last one was definitely one that really grounded my study, because again, during the beginning I didn't really know what exactly I wanted to do with like the idea of over-sexualization. But one of the sources that like really grounded my research was Lennon et al. 2016, which was a comparative content analysis of like women's Halloween costumes and men's Halloween costumes. So by using like that framework, I was able to put it more so into an academic framework where it's not just a Halloween costume, but by connecting it to like these various sources about how like over-sexualization can contribute to like negative mental health effects and all these things, it shows that it's not just a Halloween costume, but it's like building on to this idea of like this over-sexualization is leading to negative effects on children, women, even men and boys.
So that Lennon et al. Study, because you've cited it multiple times over the course of the year, that's just, let's say, just to give examples, you have a male police officer costume, and then on the same website you have a police officer costume that's for like a woman.
Yes.
So, and it was like comparing these two things.
Right. It was basically defined. So basically what Lennon et al. Did, she split the body up into various parts, but she only discussed coverage and tightness. So obviously in every single costume that she analyzed, she found that the women's costume, based on those various body parts, were significantly tighter and had less coverage than the men's Halloween costumes.
But your spin on it is different, and it has to do with that last point of sexual objectification that you're talking about. You actually geared this. You didn't do a cross-gender analysis. You looked within the same gender to see, with age, what's the difference.
Right, because, again, throughout my, looking for scholarly sources, a lot of it was specifically talking about how women are sexually objectified. But then, again, connecting back to that Mean Girls quote, I was like, well, this is also seen in kids. And, you would think that, women can be more sexualized than girls are being, right? So... because again, when sexuality is imposed on somebody, that leads to over-sexualization. So again, when sexuality is being imposed on children, that's kind of what I geared my focus of, because it was already stated in various sources that women's Halloween costumes are more sexualized than men's Halloween costumes. So again, that also addresses my gap. There was no point in
it's already there.
To keep going, but I couldn't find anything comparing women's Halloween costumes to girls' Halloween costumes.
All right. And then this is a good segue to you, Katie. So Kaylee's doing this comparison between, women and girls. Your comparison is between men and women and how they demonstrate objectification in song lyrics. Is that correct?
Yeah, but a big thing for me was I wanted to put that emphasis on sort of how they affect each other. So I felt that a lot of the studies I looked at previously, just to sort of inform my background knowledge, a lot of them focus on just okay, let's say women are objectified, but they were looking at how women and men objectify them, and I sort of wanted to isolate that variable and focus on how men objectify women versus how women objectify men. So I did that by looking at the lyrics of these songs.
And how many songs did you analyze?
So total, I did 2 weeks with 20 songs and 10 for each gender. So sort of the breakdown of that was I had week 1, it was 20 songs, 10 of those songs were by men, 10 were by women, and then I repeated that for another week.
Okay, and it's a snapshot of Billboard R&B and hip hop.
Yeah.
And we were just talking about this before we started recording. Is Drake on there?
Okay, so to my knowledge, if I'm remembering correctly, I don't remember seeing Drake on there, which is I'm honestly surprised by that. I guess he hasn't really put out new music until last night, I guess. Yeah. But I don't. Yeah, 3 albums.
3 albums.
3.
He was working really hard while you were doing this project. He was waiting until you were
exactly.
Yeah.
I don't see any songs from Maid of Honor making their way up in that list either. But
okay. So we can't tell at this point if that's because Maid of Honor is not good enough to be on the Billboard charts. And I'm not trying to start a beef with Drake at all. But we just don't know right now if something might appear.
Right.
Maybe. Because I was just wondering if he would be in the pop charts or he would be in the hip hop and R&B.
I mean, I looked it up and it says it's hip hop and R&B, but I feel again it's probably just recently he hasn't put anything new, so it was kind of reflecting what was being played recently. So I mean, I guess.
So Drake's not there. Who is there? Who is in this list? Give us some of the artists who are in the R&B and hip hop charts over the span of your work.
Okay, so one that popped up was Tyla, and something with her that I noticed was I think there's a big emphasis, and that's kind of why I looked at that expanded version of objectification. There's a big emphasis on sexual objectification, and I noticed that with her, she was one of her songs was the one with the most objectification, total, in numbers. And I found it interesting because she didn't really focus on sexual objectification. Hers was more about instrumentality, which was sort of seeing a person as a tool, or they could do something for you. So it's kind of sometimes that could be sexual, yes, but other times it was doing being like a provider or something like that.
Okay.
And so that showed up a lot within her thing, and it was sort of like, I mean, also there's like that factor you have to consider about like repetition. Like it is because she said like the same thing like a bunch of times, and that's just sort of like the nature of music. But that was something I found interesting. So she was definitely up there. I think.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
So how did you deal with that when you're seeing that? Because you're bringing up two really important points, and for someone like yourself who's doing a content analysis of lyrics, is the repetition worth noting when doing your frequency counts? Because that, like, the audience is going to walk away, like a chorus or a hook is meant to just like dig into your head and be an earworm and just sit there. So is that part of it, or would you just kind of code that as like, oh, here's a single instance, or was it every time that instrumentality was mentioned in a sexually objectifying way, not in a provider way? Was that noted in your counts?
That was actually something that like I actually had to focus early on. It was sort of something I debated. Initially, when I did like my pilot, my plan was just sort of count it once. So if something repeated, just count it once. But after that, I really sat with that idea and I thought about it, and I was like, if I'm trying to represent like a whole song, like it makes more sense to count every time it's stated. So I kind of ended up going that route.
If 60% of the song is that sentiment.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah,
so
sense.
A lot of the like it doesn't necessarily reflect like there's this many unique objectification statements, but it's just sort of like total, like in general.
Yeah. Okay. All right, we'll get to the results in a second, but let's get to Kaylee's process. This is a good segue. So Kaylee, you were on Spirit Halloween's website a whole lot. You want to explain to people what you were doing to try to get your data?
Yeah. So basically, like I said, since it's already said that women's Halloween costumes are sexualized, what I decided to do was to go into Spirit Halloween, and there's like the drop-down menus, and I went to the drop-down menu that specifically stated sexy women's Halloween costumes. So
wait, there's just a drop-down?
Yes. Okay. It's like you go to the, it'll be like women's costumes, men's costumes, and then it'll be like character costumes, superhero costumes, but then there's literally one that says sexy costumes.
So I have to ask this question before we get into this. If I'm a woman and I just click on Halloween costumes and I don't click the sexy category, are those costumes still sexy?
Yeah, that's one thing that I found a lot was that there was kind of no difference. It was kind of just the way they were phrased.
Yeah,
so for example, there would be like the police officer costume, and it'll be the same, it literally looks like the same costume. Maybe one's a little shorter. And then for the regular, it would just be like, oh, women's police officer costume. But then for the adult, it was like adult pat you down costume. So it was like, again, this emphasis on sexualization.
Okay.
So I wanted to see, again, like I said, when comparing women's to girls' costumes, I wanted to see if the same sexualization apparent in women's costumes was also apparent in girls' costumes. So because of that, I decided to find the sexy women's Halloween costumes and then find the same type of costume in the girls' costume. So since there was no drop-down menu that said, obviously, sexy girls' costumes, because that would be...
I hope not.
Yeah, but throughout my research, I found that there was really no statistical significant difference between both types of costumes.
So, just to give the audience an idea here, you would look for, let's say, what was the name of the police officer? It was like the pat you down.
Yeah, it was adult pat you down police officer costume.
And that was the sexy women's costume.
Yes.
But then there would be a young, like, girls equivalent, which would be what?
It was like, that one was Officer Cutie costume.
Okay.
So it's still this emphasis on attractiveness, but then it's like, it's that also like idea of like infantilization as well.
Yeah. And you want to give people an idea of like the 5 categories, because you had categories. You had like sheerness, like how sheer the material was, the tightness of the material, the coverage, which I believe. What was the study you got that from again? Was that the?
So that was from Lennon et al. Okay. Yeah. So again, she only talks about tightness and coverage, but then what I wanted to do was expand that framework. So I did the emphasis on tightness, coverage, any type of use of sexualized material. So that would be like lace, fishnets, things like that. that. And then I also talked about sheerness, so whether the person was wearing like if they were like had stockings or lace or anything that was sheer. I also talked about the description of the costume. So for example, like the adult pat you down police officer costume, that's obviously like insinuating like sexual ideas.
Yep.
And then I also talked about the pose of the model, because I noticed that this also like leads to my more like qualitative aspect of my study, where it wasn't just like is this short, is this not short, but it was more of like connecting it back to like gender theory, how exactly this like model is being put out there for girls and women to see, and to see whether or not like that would be considered sexualized or not.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay. And the results are that there mostly is no difference in the way that the girls' costumes are described. I'm going to say, like, because that's a component of your work, too, is the description.
Yeah.
How they're described on the website, and in terms of tightness, no difference.
No difference, yeah.
Coverage.
There was a statistical significance with coverage, yes.
There's a difference. Sheerness.
No difference.
No difference. And then the rest of them, no difference.
No difference. There was no difference in any of the categories except for coverage.
That's it.
That's
That's basically it.
Yeah.
All right. So let's get to your results, Katie. You had, and then I want to close this talking about your work. Both of you, your work seems to be facing toward adolescence. Like this is probably most relevant to them. So I want to close talking about that. We only have a few minutes left. So Katie, in this cross-gender comparison, what did you find out about the frequency of the way that, the frequency between male and female objectification, R&B and hip hop, but also how they objectify? Because I think those were the two things you were looking for, right?
Yeah, so I made some like general I noticed some general patterns just like from observing, just like face front. And something I looked at was sort of like this theme of women using instrumentality. So I like kind of took that to note in regards of like what themes like each gender uses. That was something that stood out to me. And then in terms of sort of like that frequency, I noted that on average, like after taking an average of all my values, like I found that men objectified more, even though it was only by a little bit. But
so no statistically significant difference?
No, because that was sort of just from my observations. But then I ran like a chi-square test and I ran a t-test, and overall I found that for both, gender didn't really play a role in like distribution or frequency. But I think like there's always that consideration of like the limitations. So for example, something I noted was like I only did 2 weeks just because that's like what time permitted. So maybe like if I had done more, maybe I would see more of a significance there, because that was something that sort of like strayed a little bit from my literature. Like I expected for there to be a much more statistically significant difference based on that. So it sort of shocked me to like see that in my own study.
Yeah, if you always have the summer if you want to just for funsies. Yeah. Listen to, maybe Drake will be in there. Maybe he will. So, which category of objectification appeared? So it sounds like instrumentality.
Yeah.
Is that the most frequently occurring for both men and women? Are they the most likely to employ that, or is there a difference based on your work?
So, well, it was something that was definitely like. So I basically put my values into like a graph for each week, sort of just to visualize that distribution better. Yeah, and something I saw was just like there was just in general there was a spike in instrumentality like for both men and women, but you kind of break that down further and then you see men versus women in that same category, and I saw that women had a lot more instrumentality. And something else I saw was like the distributions were sort of different. I analyzed that like women tended to focus on like 1 or 2, maybe 3 like themes, but then men focused on like way more. So I was kind of like, is there more variety there? Like,
there's a broader spectrum of objectification that men are engaging in, is what you're saying, based on the songs you analyzed. And women are engaging in just as much of objectification, but it's really narrowed. It's like a narrowed,
pretty much, yeah.
Okay. All right. So this question is for both of you, whoever wants to jump in first. What surprised you the most about the work that you did over the course of this year?
So So going into the into my research, I expected for there to be much more differences between women's costumes and girls' costumes, especially because of the women's costumes that I were analyzing were considered over-sexualized because they were literally called sexy women's Halloween costumes. So I expected for there to be much more of a difference. And again, in the only category that there was a difference was coverage, but then the same costumes that were very low in coverage were high in other categories like tightness. Were very high in coverage, were like low, high in other categories as well, like tightness. So that just goes to show how there's like, even though girls' Halloween costumes are they're being over-sexualized or less over-sexualized, I guess you could say, they're still being over-sexualized in other ways.
So yeah, the coverage component, the coverage one would be pretty blatant if you had like a young girl wearing next to nothing.
Right.
So it sounds like you're pushing the idea that there's almost this compensation of, okay, well, there has to be clothes on these kids. We'll just make those clothes lacy and as tight as possible.
Absolutely. And put her in fishnets and all these things. Yeah. So then it's not technically being like, oh, like that's a sexy girl's costume, but there are components of like, there's this idea of like conflicted components of it.
Before I go to Katie, I don't know if you know the answer to this question. You don't have to if you don't know. But any idea of when this shift occurred? Is there like a year where people are like, yeah, this is when it starts?
So I do think that there has been an increase since like this idea of like these like pop stars and all of this has been coming out. So I read a source.
You're talking like Britney Spears?
Yeah. Oh, wow. So I read a source that was basically talking about how like when there's an increase in like over-sexualization in like the media, that often shows that there's an increase of over-sexualization in other categories as
like
well.
Trickles down.
Right. Okay. So like, or even like when like TV and like TV shows first started coming out and things like that, people I guess you could say like got bored. So then they were like putting things that weren't considered, age appropriate on supposedly age appropriate shows, and then again through societal pressure, kids are like, okay, well that's what I have to do. Yeah.
All right, Katie, what surprised you the most?
I kind of have two. One more related to my study and like one more related to just like the impact.
Yeah.
So related to my study, sort of like briefly mentioned it earlier, but sort of like in terms of those results, I didn't expect to see that much similarity because I feel like within like just based off of what I read previously, I felt that there was, for lack of better words, sort of like this victim aspect like for women versus this perpetrator for men. And so I expected to see a lot more objectification from men to women. Mm-hmm. So just sort of seeing that there was like so much similarity. And I saw that within some sources mentioned like this whole idea of objectification is so often like just focused on women, but men do experience it too. And that's sort of something I wanted to look at.
Okay.
But also like in terms of impact, I think it really shocked me to see, just because I spent so much time like with this and like with this research, like I realized how much like objectification like people consume on the daily. So like even me personally, like I listen to music every day, and sometimes I'll put on a song and I'll start to listen and I'll be like, oh, that's instrumentality, or oh, this is fungibility. Like I sort of just categorize it like mentally, like, and it's crazy to see that like I didn't see this before, but just after like this research, like it's something I sort of internalized, I feel like.
You don't know what you don't know, and now now you're viewing. Well, I mean, what you're describing though is just critical thinking. Like you're viewing something critically. You're not just blindly listening to it, or I don't know if deftly listening to it, but you're not just listening to it and not hearing what's actually occurring and the greater context surrounding it. And I think both of your work, again, is very focused on adolescence and people who are experiencing that moment in their lives where they're in this perpetual state of becoming something. They don't know what that is, which is probably why there's so much like difficulty at that age. Like you just don't know what you are yet, but there's a lot of messages that are being sent of this is something you could be if you want to be. Like if you want, if you want to be a cutie pie police officer or whatever. And Katie, after you happened to present on Bring Your Child to Work Day, and my 12-year-old was in the audience watching your presentation on sexual objectification, and he just first thing he says to me, he goes, "That was really good." He goes, "I'm not going to change the music I listen to," like in this like act of rebellion. And I just went, I'm like, you don't have to change the music you listen to. I'm like, you have to change the way you listen to the music that you listen to. Like, if you can be like, this isn't like, whatever, you like the beat, you like how it sounds. It's one thing, but there's a message that's traveling with that too, that you need to be mindful of. I feel like I don't know. Do you agree with that? Do you disagree with that?
Yeah, I think there's a difference between like actually sort of acting on those like messages of objectification and like perpetrating it versus like being conscious that you're like taking it in and consuming it. And I think that's like a big thing. Just like know what you're listening to, like, because this does have like actual effects. Like it affects your mental health, it affects like your interactions, your behavior in society. So just knowing what you're listening to, I think is important.
Yeah, you don't have to perceive it as normal.
Right.
And what about you, Kelly? Because the bell's gonna ring while you're talking. But any thoughts on this?
Right. Just like realistically, you don't really have to change what you're doing. For example, like me, like I'm still gonna, wear what I want to wear, do what I want to do, whatever the case may be. But then I'm just very much more conscious of it. So, for example, I was literally at Target the other day, and they came out with like the bathing suits, and there was like the little girls' bathing suits, and I was like, "That's extra tight," or "That's this," or "That's like showing the abdomen," or whatever the case may be. So again, like if you really do want to wear the things that you want to wear, because again, everyone has their own fashion sense, but just like being conscious of maybe I am portraying something that I personally don't want to be portraying, but that's what society is making me feel like I have to do.
Yeah, and the bell just rang, and people are shuffling out the room right now. They're just so ready for their Friday.
To listen to Drake's new album.
That's
albums.
Albums.
3,
yeah. He just couldn't wait.
Yeah.
He just couldn't wait. He couldn't just. It wasn't like an extended release. Like it just had to all happen in one day.
Yep.
All right. That's how Jimmy from Degrassi rolls. All right. Thank you both for your time.
All right. Thank you.
Yeah.